Tonight, a house with no lock on its door and no hour on its wall. In the Middle Ages, a wayside inn never really closed, because closing, in the way you mean it, had not yet been invented. There were no opening times to keep, and none to break. A house like this did not open at a moment and shut at another. It simply stayed awake, the way a household stays awake, for as long as there was anyone inside it who still needed feeding. If quiet history like this helps you unwind at the end of a long day, you are welcome to follow along, though only if these evenings genuinely do you good. Tell me where in the world you are listening from, and what hour it has reached where you are. Now let the room grow dim and settle where you lie. What you want tonight is simple: warmth, something to eat, a cup of ale, and a corner of a bed until morning. So let us go and find it. It is not an inn in any sense a modern traveller would recognize, and that difference is the whole of what makes the night ahead worth describing. You are on foot, a mile from a small walled town, and the light is almost gone. The road has turned the colour of the sky. Ahead, a low timber building leans into the dusk, its shutters edged with warm light, a thread of smoke standing straight above the roof. You have been walking since midday, and the sight of it does something to your shoulders that you did not ask them to do. You slow, without meaning to, and turn toward the door. A green branch over a door was the whole of the signage, and it told you everything you needed to know from the far end of the road. Nobody advertised in writing, because almost nobody on the road could have read it, and a branch needed no reading at all. Over that door, a leafy branch has been tied to a pole that juts out above the road, turning a little in the cold air. It is not decoration. It is a message, and a fairly shameless one. It means fresh ale has been brewed inside and is ready to drink. The house is advertising the one thing it most wants you to want, before you have said a single word, and long before the town itself has decided whether to let you in at all. Towns shut their gates at the bell, so arriving late did not merely inconvenience you. It decided, entirely, which side of the wall you would be sleeping on. You have arrived somewhere in England, around the year 1400, and you have arrived, as travellers so often did, a little too late in the day. The gate of the town beyond is already a dark shape against a darker hill, but here, on this side of the wall, the door gives under your hand, and a wall of warm noise comes out to meet you. Voices, the knock of wooden cups, the settle and spit of a real fire. You step in, and the cold lets go of your back. Warmth is the product being sold here, more than the ale is, and everyone who steps through that door is buying the same thing. Cold leaves the body slowly and in stages, and the first of those stages is worth whatever the ale costs. Inside is one long low room, thick with smoke and the smell of people and pottage and burning wood. Benches line a plank table. A fire holds the middle of the far wall like the heart of the whole arrangement, and around it the good seats are already taken. This is the first quiet lesson of the medieval night. Everyone wants the same warm bench. There is never quite enough of it, and arriving late means you have already lost the argument you did not know you were having. The gate closing is not a punishment aimed at you. It is simply a town doing the one thing towns did every evening without exception. The gates were hauled shut and locked at the bell, and a traveller on the wrong side of them had exactly one category of options left. So you take what is left, a place near the end of the table where the heat arrives second-hand, and you set down your bundle where you can feel it against your leg. No one asks your name. No one writes anything down. A woman crosses the room toward you, wiping her hands, reading you the way you might read the weather. Tired, cold, carrying coin, or not. She has done this 1,000 times, and she has already decided most of what she needs to know. She has judged a great many travellers by the door, and she has been wrong about very few of them. She reads posture, boots, and the hour of arrival, and between those three she has a fair picture before you sit down. She is not a servant of some grander owner behind a curtain. As far as you can tell, she is the house. She brews the ale, she keeps the fire, she decides who sleeps where, and she will remember exactly what you owe long after you have forgotten. You have not walked into a business, quite. You have walked into someone's front room, where the price of the warmth is that you behave, more or less, like a guest who knows he is one. Alehouses were frequently the front room of somebody's home, run by a woman who had brewed the ale herself, and the manners of a guest applied accordingly. The alewife brewed what she sold in the house she lived in, which makes her a brewer and a landlady and a host in one person. For most ordinary ale, this was the shape of it, not a grand tavern of wine and vintners, and not always a proper inn with stables and beds, but an alehouse, which was often simply a home where the woman of the house brewed more ale than her family could drink and sold the rest. She was called an alewife, and the brewing was hers. The room you are sitting in tonight is, in the daytime, just the front of her house. Tomorrow this room is a kitchen again, and the bench you are sitting on will hold somebody's washing. The distinction between a house and a business was not one anybody here needed drawn, because the same room did both jobs on the same day, which means the line between her home and her trade is not a line at all. The same fire that boils tomorrow's pottage warms your feet tonight. The bench you are on may be where her own family eats. You are, in a real sense, a stranger she has agreed to have in her living room until dawn, drinking the ale she made herself, and the arrangement works only because everyone involved has quietly agreed not to point that out. The arrangement is informal in law and entirely formal in practice, which is a distinction everyone present understands and nobody states. She brings you ale in a wooden cup, dark and cloudy and faintly sweet, closer to a thin bread than to anything you would call a drink today. It is food as much as refreshment, and it is safer than most of the water you could have drunk on the road. You wrap both hands around the cup. The first swallow is warm going down, and for a moment the long day behind you loses some of its detail, which is exactly what you paid for. You paid for the losing of detail as much as for the ale, and both are being delivered on schedule. The day loses its edges rather than its facts, which is the specific service being provided here. What you did not pay, and could not, was whatever she felt like charging. The strength and the price of that cup were not entirely her own affair. They were bound by law, by a rule with the heavy name of the Assize of Bread and Ale, set out under Henry III, and usually dated to the 1260s. It tied what ale could lawfully cost, and how strong it had to be, to the going price of grain. Even her generosity had a ceiling written down somewhere by men she would never meet. The Assize of Bread and Ale, dated to around 1266, tied the lawful price and strength of what she pours to the price of grain itself. Tying the price of ale to the price of grain meant the alewife's generosity had a ceiling set by men she would never meet. The logic was fair enough if you were the one making the rules. Grain and ale came from the same fields. When harvests were good and grain was cheap, ale was meant to be cheap too. When the price of grain climbed, the alewife was allowed to charge more, or to brew a thinner ale for the same coin. The law bent with the weather, so that a cup of ale stayed roughly honest whether the year had been kind or cruel to the fields outside. A bad harvest changed the price of the grain, and not the honesty of the cup, which was precisely what the law was written to achieve. Grain prices moved constantly, and the cup did not, which put the entire risk of a bad year onto the brewer rather than the drinker. It is a strangely modern thing to find in a smoky medieval room, a price control, printed centuries before anyone would use that phrase, sitting quietly inside your cup. The alewife almost certainly could not have recited the statute to you. She did not need to. She had grown up inside its edges, the way you grow up knowing which floorboards creak, and she brewed to the shape of a law she had never once read. She has never read a word of the statute and brews inside its shape anyway, because that is what a lifetime in a trade does to a person. A trade learned by watching rather than reading still ends up shaped by the statute, because the statute shaped everyone she learnt it from, and she was watched, not by her neighbours only, though they watched too, but by an actual officer of the town, appointed for the purpose, with a title that sounds invented and was not. He was the ale conner, the ale taster, and his job was to go from alehouse to alehouse, deciding whether the ale was good enough and whether the measure was honest. Somewhere in this town, a man is paid a small sum each year to drink critically on the public's behalf. You are drinking under supervision you cannot see, because somewhere in this town a man is paid a small sum each year to drink critically on your behalf. You picture him arriving, unhurried, expecting to be taken seriously, and you are not entirely wrong to smile. But the work behind the title was real. He checked that a cup held what a cup was supposed to hold, and that the ale inside it had not been quietly watered or weakened to stretch a batch further. An alewife who sold short measure or thin ale at full-strength prices could be fined and shamed for it. The taster was the town's slow, patient way of keeping her honest. Ale conners were appointed locally to test quality and check the measures, which is a remarkably specific job to have invented and then kept. Testing quality and checking the measures were two separate jobs, and the town cared about both enough to pay for them. So the cup in your hands has in a sense already passed an inspection. Its size is a legal fact. Its strength answers to the price of wheat in fields you walked past today without noticing. None of that is why it tastes good at the end of a cold walk, but it is quietly reassuring to a tired traveller to know that in a world with very few certainties, the one in his hands was measured by somebody whose only job was to be suspicious of it. Very little else in your day was measured by anyone whose entire office was suspicion, and the cup in your hand is the exception. Almost nothing else you consumed that year had been checked by anyone at all, let alone by a man employed to doubt it. Now, here is the thing you keep waiting for, and it does not come. Nobody tells you when to leave. There is no last call, no bell inside the room, no moment where the alewife announces that the house is closing and you should settle up. You keep glancing toward the door as if some rule is about to arrive and end the evening. It will not. You cannot be thrown out at 11, because in this room there is no such thing as 11. There is no closing time, because there is no clock to close by, and the room simply runs until the people in it stop. Hours in this room are marked by people leaving, and by nothing else whatsoever. Time here is not a number. It is the light, and it is bells. The day began when the sky greyed and the birds started, and it will end when people are too tired to keep it going. Between those two soft edges, there is no grid of hours, no minute hand deciding anything. The alewife does not close at a time because she has no time to close at. She stops when the last guest sleeps, and starts again when the first one stirs. You will not be asked to leave. She stops when the last guest sleeps, and begins again when the first one stirs, and neither moment is set by anything but people. It is a strange freedom to sit inside, if you have spent your life being told the hour. The house is not open late, exactly. Late is a comparison, and there is nothing here to compare it to. The house is simply open for as long as it is useful, which turns out to be most of the night, because someone is always cold, or hungry, or newly arrived, or unwilling to admit that the day is over. Tonight, that someone is partly you. The house keeps going because somebody in it is still awake and still wants something. And tonight, a fair share of that somebody is you. The house has no fixed hours, because the people in it have no fixed hours, and the two facts hold each other up. It is worth being honest about how we know any of this. We were not there. No alewife left you her diary of an ordinary Tuesday. What survives from a night like this is mostly the paperwork of things going slightly wrong. Court rolls, fines, guild rules, the assize itself. History remembers the medieval alehouse best at the exact moments it misbehaved, and has to reconstruct all the quiet, well-run evenings around the edges of the trouble. Court records preserve the evenings that went wrong, which means the ordinary ones survive only as the silence around the trouble. A court record is a record of failure, and this house has generated none, which is why it has no history worth reading, which is its own small joke at our expense. The calmest, most ordinary night, The one you are sitting in right now is precisely the night that left no record at all. A well-poured cup and a peaceful room generate no complaint, and a world that only writes things down when they break leaves the historian to imagine the peace between the fines. So picture this evening as one of the countless quiet ones nobody bothered to report. Nobody wrote down a quiet night. So a quiet night is what has to be reconstructed from the edges of the loud ones. The evenings that left no record are the ones that went well, which makes the ordinary night the hardest thing to recover. And then, out in the dark, a bell. Not a joyful one. A slow, deliberate evening bell from the church tower, carrying over the roofs. The room does not stop, but it changes. A few heads lift. The alewife glances toward the fire without hurrying. That bell has a job, and everyone in this room grew up obeying it. It is the curfew, and it is not, as you might think, a bell that tells people to go to bed. The curfew bell is not an instruction to sleep. It is an instruction about fire, which was the only thing a medieval town genuinely could not survive. It is a bell that tells them to deal with their fire. The word itself gives it away, once you hear it slowly. Curfew comes from the old French couvre-feu, which means, plainly, cover the fire. When the bell rang, usually somewhere around 8 or 9 in the evening, you were meant to bank your hearth for the night. Of all the things a medieval town chose to enforce with a bell, the most important was making sure you had tidied away your flames. Couvre-feu means cover the fire, and the bell meant exactly that, in the plainest possible terms, to everyone who heard it. The bell came around 8 or 9 in the evening in many towns, which is early enough to be about fire and nothing else. It sounds fussy until you remember what these towns were made of. Timber, and thatch, and more timber, packed wall to wall along lanes barely wide enough for a cart, with a live fire burning in nearly every building, one unattended hearth, one stray spark carried on a night wind, and a whole street could be ash before the sun came up. Nobody in this room has ever seen a fire brigade, because there is no such thing, and will not be for centuries. There is no engine, no hose, no company of men who come running when a roof catches. There is only water carried by hand, and neighbours, and luck. The curfew bell is the closest thing this town has to a defence, and it works in the humblest way imaginable, by making every single household its own fire warden, every single night. So covering the fire was never really a suggestion. It sat much closer to a rule you could be fined for ignoring, because your carelessness was never only your own. It belonged to everyone who slept downwind of you. A loose flame was never a private matter. It belonged to every roof downwind, which is why the rule was public and the bell was loud. And notice, carefully, what covering the fire does not mean. It does not mean putting it out. Nobody in this house wants to wake to a dead, cold, grey hearth, because starting a fire again from nothing is one of the more thankless jobs the morning can hand you. There are no matches here. To make new fire you need flint and a piece of steel, and a scrap of scorched cloth to catch the spark, and dry tinder, and a steady hand, and a good deal more patience than anyone has before dawn on a cold day. So the real skill of the curfew, the quiet craft of it, is to kill the flames without killing the fire itself. You rake the glowing embers into a low heap at the back of the hearth. You draw the cooler ash up and over them like a soft grey blanket, and you leave them there to breathe as slowly as a sleeping animal, banked down under their own ash, so that the fire does not die in the night. It only sleeps and waits to be woken. A banked fire smoulders for hours and can be revived with fuel and air, which is why covering it is a saving rather than an ending. Fuel and air will bring it back in the morning, and that certainty is what lets everyone go to sleep. Done with care, a fire banked like that will hold its warmth for hours, sometimes clean through the night and well into the following day. The embers settle under their coat of ash, barely alive, giving off almost no light and almost no smoke, keeping just enough of themselves in reserve to be called back. And in the morning the waking of it is one of the simplest, most satisfying things in the whole day. You rake the grey aside, And there, underneath, is the deep red heart of last night's fire, still glowing, faithful, exactly where you left it. You lay on a little dry kindling, you lean down close, closer than feels dignified, and you give it your own slow breath, and the coals brighten, and a thread of flame climbs up, and the whole warm business of the house begins again as though it had never paused. A covered fire, then, is not an ending at all. It is a quiet promise the household makes to itself that tomorrow, whatever else it brings, will at least begin warm. Relighting from nothing was slow and awkward enough that the whole town organized its evening around avoiding it. A household that let its fire go out entirely faced an awkward morning, so covering it properly was a promise made to tomorrow. So watch the alewife keep that promise now. She crosses to the hearth without a word and does the oldest chore in the house, the one her mother taught her and her mother taught before that. She rakes the burning wood down into a low red heap. She pulls the pale ash across it with the flat of an iron, patient, unhurried, entirely unbothered, the way you might settle a child who does this every night and needs no fuss made over it. The bright, dancing flames drop away under her hand. The tall shadows on the walls shorten and go still. The whole room dims by half in the space of a minute. And what is left behind is not darkness, but a deep, low, even glow, a red warmth breathing quietly out of the covered coals, a heat that will still be faithfully here long after the last of the loud, bright light of the evening has been let go. She stands a moment, checks it, and turns away satisfied. She checks the covering the way you would check a lock, and for much the same reason. The whole feeling of the room changes with the fire. The hard, leaping shadows settle down onto the floor and stay there. Faces that were sharp and orange a moment ago go soft and low and kind, and the voices in the room, without anyone deciding it or noticing it, drop a little lower to match the light, the way people always lower their voices near something that is sleeping. A banked fire is a far quieter companion than a blazing one, and the company around it adjusts by pure instinct, leaning in, slowing down, saying less, and meaning it more. The evening has not ended. Nothing has been announced. It has simply been turned down, the way a careful hand turns down a lamp by easing the wick, lower and lower, to a level a tired body can sink all the way into, rather than merely sit beside and endure. You feel the room drop into its lower register, and your body understands the change before you have consciously noticed it at all. The room drops to the level a tired body can sink into, rather than merely sit beside, and that same bell, the one that just banked every fire in the town, was quietly doing a second job while you watched the ash go over the coals. Beyond the wall, in the town proper, the great gates were being closed. In many walled towns, the ringing of the curfew and the locking of the gates were nearly the same event, two halves of one nightly ritual. When the bell sounded, the heavy timber gates were hauled shut on their iron hinges and barred from the inside, and the town sealed itself against the dark and against the road, the way a household draws and bolts its own front door before bed. It is a sensible arrangement, an old and careful one, walls and a gate and a bell to close it, a whole community tucking itself in for the night behind good oak. It is entirely reasonable. It is only a problem at all if you happen to be standing on the wrong side of it when it shuts, which tonight, of course, is precisely where you were. The bell that shut the gate is the same bell that saved the fire, doing two jobs on one swing of the rope, two duties, one rope, one sound, repeated every evening in every walled town in the country. That is why you are out here, and not in there. You reached the town a little too late, and the gate met you already shut. A blank wall of oak and iron with a small barred grille set into it, and a gatekeeper on the far side, wholly uninterested in your reasons. It did not matter how far you had come, or how good your excuse was, or how respectable you looked in better light. Inside were dry beds, and lit windows, and perhaps even people who knew your name, and every bit of it was sealed away from you until the sky came back and the bar was lifted. So you did the only sensible thing, the thing that late travelers had done for as long as there had been walls to be shut out of. You turned your back on the town and walked to the last warm light you had passed on the road, the low house with the green branch over its door, and you counted yourself genuinely lucky that it was there. The green branch was not decoration, it was the only advertising the law would eventually permit, and it worked on tired people at a distance. The branch worked because it was visible, unmistakable, and required nothing of the traveller but eyes and exhaustion, and that is the deeper reason a house like this never truly closed. It lived, and made its living, in the very gap the town left open every night. A walled town shut itself for safety when the light failed, and every single night that shutting stranded somebody outside it. A merchant a day behind his own plan, a messenger who misjudged the strength of the daylight, a pilgrim, a cattle drover, a peddler with a heavy pack, a man with bad boots and worse luck. All of them, night after night, spilled out into the narrow strip of world just beyond the locked gate, and all of them needed the identical handful of things: warmth, food, drink, a roof, and a patch of floor to lie on. The inn does not stay awake half the night in spite of the curfew and the gate. It stays awake, in large part, because of them. The town closes, and in closing, hands the house its trade. You are inside because the town closed, and the house has your custom for exactly the same reason. Think back to that branch over the door, the leafy one that first pulled you in off the darkening road. It turns out to have a proper name, that pole, and a proper purpose. It is an ale stake, a length of wood fixed out horizontally above the entrance, jutting into the street, and the bush of green leaves tied to its far end was the entire point of the thing. In a world where most people who passed on the road could not read so much as their own name, a painted signboard full of letters would have said nothing to almost anyone. But a fresh green branch said the one thing that mattered to every traveller alive, and said it instantly, and said it without a single word. It said, "There is ale here. It is newly brewed. It is ready. Come in out of the dark." A bundle of leaves against a grey timber wall, and every tired soul on the road understood it perfectly at a single glance. The sign had to be legible to somebody exhausted, in poor light, from further away than you would think, and a branch managed all three. Grey timber, a green branch, and a tired traveller are all the parts that sign ever needed. The bush was also, though you would not guess it to look at it, a kind of open invitation to be inspected. When a house set its ale stake out to announce that a new batch of ale was ready, that same green signal told the ale conner it was time to come and do his tasting, to judge the brew before too much of it had gone down too many grateful throats. So the very branch that called you in off the road also, quietly, summoned the inspector to the door. The alewife, in the simple act of advertising her ale to travellers, was at the same moment agreeing to have that ale examined by the town. The bush was a welcome, and a summons folded into one, a promise to the customer, and a signal to the officer. And she hung it out over the street anyway, willingly, every time she brewed, because a barrel of good ale that nobody on the road had heard about was a barrel of good ale that nobody bought. An unadvertised barrel was an unsold barrel, which is the whole economic argument for hanging anything over a door at all. An unseen barrel earned nothing, and a house that could not be found from the road was a house with an empty room. You can imagine, easily enough, how these poles began to multiply and compete. Every alehouse on a road wanted its own branch seen first, and seen from furthest off, before a thirsty and undecided traveller had committed his feet and his coin to a rival's door a little further along. So the poles grew longer. They reached further and further out over the street, each one leaning a fraction more boldly into the shared air above the road than the house next door had dared to, in a slow, silent, entirely predictable competition that no one ever declared, and no one could quite stop. What began as one modest green signal over one door became, house by ambitious house, a slow-leaning forest of advertising, crowding into the one strip of open air that everyone had to pass through. The stakes grew longer and longer, as each house tried to be seen first, until the street became a competition conducted in timber. Each house wanted its sign seen before the one next door, so the poles grew outward into the street until the street objected, and eventually, somewhere, in some particular town, that crowding got out of hand enough to end up written down, which is the only reason we can sit here and know about it at all. In London, in the year 1375, the city justices heard formal complaints that these alepoles had grown into a genuine public nuisance. They were sticking out so far over the road and hanging so heavy and so low that they were fouling riders as they passed by on horseback. A man mounted on a tall horse could apparently expect, going down the wrong street, to be caught across the head by the local advertising. It is a small, absurd, entirely believable picture, and so the justices did the very medieval thing to do about it, which is also, when you think about it, the very modern thing to do about it. They stopped, and they considered the problem soberly, and they passed a rule. In 1375, London simply legislated the length of them, which is the least romantic and most believable ending such a competition could have. No ale pole, they ordered, from that day forward, was to reach more than 7 feet out over the King's Highway, 7 feet, and not 1 inch further. It is one of those small, specific specks of the past that feels almost too human to be real. A body of serious men in a serious chamber sitting down in earnest to fix, in law, the maximum lawful length of a pub sign, purely because the pub signs in question had begun hitting people in the face, and yet it tells you something true and worth keeping. These houses did not sit back and wait for custom. They advertised hard and openly, and they competed with one another for the eye of every traveller on the road, and they pushed out into the shared space of the street exactly as far as they were allowed, and then a little further, until the street itself, slowly and patiently and in writing, pushed back. The street pushed back in writing, slowly and patiently, the way streets generally do. A rule about the length of a pole sounds absurd until you picture a street where every house has one. So sit here for a moment in the low red light and gather up in your mind everything that has kept this room alive and awake around you tonight, and notice the one thing that is missing from the whole collection. Not a single piece of it is a clock. There was a bell that banked your fire and sealed the town at the same stroke. There was a law, old and heavy and named, that quietly shaped the very cup in your hands before you ever lifted it. There was a taster, a suspicious officer of the town, standing between you and a cheat. There was a green branch that called you in from the dark, and a locked gate that delivered you here against your plans, and, at the centre of all of it, a woman whose home this is, who has not once stopped moving since before you arrived, and who will still be moving long after you are asleep. Bells, laws, fire, and need. No clock anywhere. There is no clock in this room, no clock in the house, and no clock anywhere in the town that would concern you. Nothing in the building measures time, and nothing in the building needs to, and that, at last, is the answer to the question you carried in through the door. A medieval house like this one never really closed, because closing, in the way that you understand the word, had nothing here to close upon. Closing needs hours, and hours need a clock, and the clock that would one day rule a room like this, and tell it firmly when to stop, has simply not yet been built into its wall. In the empty place where that clock will someday hang, there is instead a loose, warm web of far older things, softer and slower and kinder and vaguer all at once. Bells and laws and firelight and hunger and the plain endless fact of human need on a dark road, and not one single thread of that web has an off switch anywhere on it. A house run by things like those does not shut for the night. It only, gradually, quiets. The evening does not end. It only thins out, guest by guest, until the noise has gone without anyone having called for quiet. Nothing announces the end of the evening because nothing here is empowered to announce it. And the woman moving quietly at the center of it all is the whole idea made flesh. Her work simply has no edge on it where it stops. She brewed the ale long before you ever came, and she will strain and set the next batch after you are asleep. She banked the fire that is warming your feet, and she will wake that same fire again before you so much as stir in the morning. If you were to sit up now and ask her, plainly, what time the alehouse closed, she would not quite understand the question. The alehouse is her house. A house does not close. The people inside it merely, one by one, in their own time, fall asleep. Everyone here falls asleep in their own time, which is a freedom so ordinary that nobody in the room would think to name it, which is beginning, if you are honest, to sound less like history and more like sound advice. The ale has done its slow, warm, unarguable work somewhere behind your ribs. The banked fire gives out that low, steady orange heat that asks absolutely nothing of you in return. The room has thinned out around you, quietly, without any announcement. Some of the earlier voices, the loud ones, the arguing ones, have already folded themselves down into corners and gone soft and then gone silent. The great business of the medieval night, all the arriving and the serving and the reckoning and the tending, is winding itself down of its own accord now. Not because anybody rang a bell for it, and not because anybody was told to stop, but simply because bodies, when you leave them to their own older sense of time, know perfectly well, without being told, when enough of one day has finally been had. Bodies that have worked since first light do not need to be told when the day has been sufficient. You finish the last of the cup. The ale is cooler now than when she brought it, and somehow it is the better for it. The way the last of a thing you did not really want to end is so often the sweetest and slowest part of the whole. Nobody comes hurrying over to take the empty cup from your hand. Nobody rings anything, or calls any order, or announces that the hour has come. The evening simply lowers itself, one soft degree and then another, down toward the quiet floor of the night, and you find that you are going down along with it, unhurried, heavy, warm, in no particular rush at all. Because for this one night, out here beyond the locked gate, in a stranger's warm front room, there is genuinely nowhere in the world that you are supposed to be, and there is no hour at all at which you are supposed to be there. That, it turns out, is a rare and comfortable thing to own. Owning your own bedtime is a rare and comfortable thing, and you have it tonight entirely by accident of having missed a gate. Very few people in this century got to decide when their own day ended. The alewife moves through the settling room one last, slow time. She stops at the hearth and checks her banked fire, drawing a little more of the pale ash up over the brightest of the coals, and she steps back a pace, to be quite sure that it will hold clean through until morning. She sets a stray cup upright on the table as she passes. She says something low and dry to the very last man still stubbornly upright, and he laughs, once, softly into the dimness, and allows himself to be gently steered toward an empty bench and the promise of sleep. The whole room is going down around you now, quietly, the way a fire goes down when it is properly covered, the bright and restless parts of it tucked away and banked, the deep warmth carefully kept, and the last of the hard light simply at last let go into the dark. The hard light goes first, then the talk, then the fire, in that order, every night, without anybody arranging it. The fire is banked, the light is out, and the room settles into the shape it will hold until somebody stirs. You find your own place among the sleepers, a corner of clean straw and a rough, shared, heavy blanket, close enough to the covered hearth to keep the long ache of the road out of your bones. And the very last thing that you are truly clearly aware of, before the night finally closes over you, is the sound of the house itself. The soft breathing of strangers, the small shifts and settlings of people finding sleep, the faint tick of cooling wood in the hearth, the whole warm, trusting weight of a room full of people who have quietly agreed, without ever saying so, to keep each other safe until the light comes back. The fire sleeps under its ash, the town sleeps behind its barred gate, and the house that never truly closes holds you, gently and without a clock, through the deepest and quietest part of the night. The house holds you through the deepest part of the night, without once telling you what hour it is. While you sleep at the inn, someone else in this world is already awake, and has been for some time. Leave the warm common room behind now, and cross the dark and empty road to another building where a light is burning, low and orange, long before there is any reason for it. It is a baker's workshop, and it is the middle of the night. Inside, a man moves in the near dark by the glow of a single lamp and the deeper glow of an oven mouth. Flour dust hangs in the light like something underwater. Along one wall, covered with cloths, wooden troughs of dough sit swelling slowly in the warmth, patient as sleeping animals. The baker himself says nothing, because there is no one to say it to. He simply feeds the fire, and waits, and feeds it again. The rest of the town will not think of him at all until morning, when the bread is somehow, as always, already there. Somewhere below the room you are sleeping in, the next day's bread has already begun. The bread that will be on the table when you wake has already been started by somebody you will never meet. For the baker, the day does not begin at dawn. It begins in the dead middle of the night, hours before the first grey light, while everyone he serves is still deep in their first sleep. This is the ordinary, unremarkable shape of his life. Others end their day when the light fails. His begins there, and the very first task, before dough, before shaping, before anything, is the fire. He must wake the oven and bring it up to its full heat, and that alone takes a long, slow, patient stretch of the night. There is a quiet joke buried in it, if you are still awake enough to notice. The one man in town whose whole purpose is to feed the morning is the one man in town who never really gets a morning of his own. He meets each new day already at work, with his sleeves pushed up and the night not yet finished. He meets each day already at work, which is a sentence that sounds poetic until you consider it means shortly after midnight. His sleeves are already pushed up at an hour when the rest of the town has not yet turned over once. So watch him wake the oven. It is a great domed thing of brick and clay, built thick and heavy to hold what it is given, and just now it is only faintly warm from the day before. He lays a fire directly on its floor, inside the dome itself, and he feeds it and lets it roar. This is not the gentle banked fire of the sleeping inn across the road. This is the opposite of that. This is a fire built up on purpose, loud and hungry and bright, allowed to burn hard and long, hour upon hour, soaking its fierce heat deep into the brick and the clay all around it, until the whole mass of the oven has drunk in as much fire as it can hold. He is not trying to cook anything yet. He is charging the oven, slowly, like filling a deep well with heat, one armful of wood at a time, in the dark. You will eat what he is starting now, and you will not think about him once while doing it. Bringing a stone oven to heat is slow work done alone in the dark, and it is why his day starts where yours ends. And this is why he cannot simply rise at dawn like everyone else and start. The oven sets his hours, not the sun. Brick and clay take their own long time to heat all the way through, and no amount of wishing hurries them. If he wants hot bread in people's hands at first light, he must have begun the fire in the deep of the night, and stood by it and fed it, through all the hours it takes for the heat to travel into the heart of the stone. His schedule is not really his own decision at all. It is dictated to him, coldly and exactly, by the physics of a heavy oven that will not be rushed. He rises when he rises because the brick demands it, and the brick has never once heard of a good excuse. So he keeps the fire, and he waits for the stone to be ready, and the night wears slowly on around him. You are asleep for the part of the process that takes the longest, which is the fire slowly filling the stone with heat, one armful at a time. When at last the oven is fully charged, when the whole dome of it is soaked through with heat and glowing faintly from within, he does something that looks, the first time you see it, like a mistake. He rakes the fire out, all of it. He drags the burning wood and the glowing coals off the oven floor and away, and he sweeps the hot floor clean, until the great chamber stands empty and dark and yet ferociously hot, holding all that stored fire silently in its walls. There is no flame left inside now. There does not need to be. The brick itself has become the fire. And into that clean, radiant, roaring hot emptiness, he begins at last to put the bread, sliding the shaped loaves in on a long wooden peel, deep into the heat that the vanished flames left behind. The flames are raked out before the loaves go in, so the bread bakes in stored heat rather than in fire. The peel goes deep into the stored heat, and the fire that made it is already raked out and gone. But the oven does not hold that fierce heat forever. From the moment the fire is raked out, it begins, very slowly, to cool. And this simple fact shapes the whole rest of his working night, because it means the bread cannot all be baked at once, or all the same way. It must be baked in waves, in a careful order set entirely by the falling temperature of the stone. The things that need the fiercest heat go in first, into the hottest, freshest oven. Then, as the brick gives up its warmth degree by degree over the hours, he moves down the scale, batch after batch, matching each kind of baking to the heat that is left. He is reading the oven the whole time, judging its falling warmth by his hand and his face and long habit, spending the stored fire down carefully, wave by wave, so that nothing is wasted before the heat is finally, fully gone. You get the first wave, the hottest, if you are early enough to the shop. The later waves belong to whoever comes after. The oven cools in waves, and the loaves are drawn in order, so nothing is wasted before the heat is finally gone. He does not do all of this entirely alone, or entirely by his own rules, even here in the middle of the night. Behind this one man at his oven stands something larger and older, a brotherhood of his trade, a guild. Bakers banded together into fraternities and companies remarkably early. In London, a fraternity of bakers is on record as far back as the middle of the 12th century, generations before much else about ordinary working life was written down at all. And these were not idle clubs. The guild set the standards of the craft, decided who was allowed to call himself a baker and who was not, trained the apprentices, guarded the secrets of the work, and closed ranks to protect its own. This solitary figure at his oven in the dark is, without thinking about it, one quiet link in a long chain of men who agreed, long ago, on exactly how this ought to be done. You benefit from an agreement made long before you were born by men who decided exactly how this ought to be done. Guilds and fraternities settled the standards early, and a baker inherited them rather than choosing them. The guild gave a baker a kind of belonging and a kind of protection in a world that offered ordinary tradesmen very little of either. But belonging always has a price, and the guild's price was obedience. In return for its protection, it bound him to its rules, its quality, its prices, its ways. He was not free to bake however he pleased, or charge whatever he liked, or cut whatever corner tempted him on a hard night. He was watched by his own brotherhood as closely as by anyone, and beyond even the guild's rules, pressing down on every loaf he made, there was the far heavier hand of the law itself, waiting for him in the daylight. A baker's fraternity is recorded in London by 1155, which puts organised bread a very long way back indeed, because bread was not merely food. Bread was the thing the ordinary person lived on, most of every day, in quantities we would find hard to imagine now. For much of the population it was the meal, the reliable centre of the diet, the difference between a hard day and a hungry one. And that made the honesty of a loaf a matter of real public importance, far too important to leave quietly to the conscience of the man who baked it. A baker who cheated on weight was not just shading a deal. He was, in a small way, taking food from people who had little enough of it already. And so the price and the size of bread, exactly like the strength and price of the alewife's ale across the road, were pulled out of the baker's own hands entirely, and written firmly into law. You could not have negotiated your loaf's weight if you wanted to. That was taken out of the baker's hands entirely, and written into law. Weight, price, and quality were all removed from the baker's discretion and written down, which is a great deal of law for a loaf. That law was the assize of bread, the same great ordinance from the same 1260s that governed the ale you drank at the inn. And it worked on a clever and rather demanding principle. It did not simply fix the price of a loaf and leave it there, year after year, while the world changed around it. Instead, it fixed the price of bread and let the weight of the loaf move. A loaf that cost a particular small coin had to weigh a particular amount, and that required weight was tied directly to the current price of grain. When wheat was cheap and plentiful after a good harvest, the penny loaf had to be large and generous. When grain grew dear in a lean year, the loaf for the same penny was allowed to shrink. The coin in the customer's hand stayed the same. What it bought quietly swelled and shrank with the harvest. The price stayed still while the loaf itself grew and shrank with the harvest, which is a stranger arrangement than it first sounds. A loaf that grew and shrank with the harvest kept its price steady, which is a kind of honesty most modern shops never attempt. This meant the baker lived his whole working life inside a set of scales he did not control and could never argue with. Every loaf he made had a lawful weight it was required to reach, a weight that shifted with the market as surely as the tides shift with the moon. And keeping to it was not a matter of rough good intentions. He had to weigh and reckon and adjust and hit the mark. Because on the other side of getting it wrong sat a punishment that was public and humiliating, and deliberately so. A baker caught selling bread that fell short of its lawful weight could be fined. Worse, he could be dragged out and set in the pillory in the open street, his short loaf displayed beside him, so that the whole town might see clearly and remember exactly who had tried to cheat them of their bread. You would have watched the punishment happen in the street, because that was the entire point of doing it there. Punishment for short weight happened publicly, in the street, so that the whole town could see who had tried it. It is out of this long shadow of the scales and the pillory that one small, familiar phrase is often said to have grown, a phrase you have used yourself without ever thinking where it came from. The baker's dozen, 13, where you asked for 12. The usual explanation runs like this. A careful baker, terrified of falling even slightly short on account and finding himself in the pillory for it, took to adding one extra loaf to every dozen he sold, a small margin of safety baked in on purpose, so that no honest mistake of weight could ever be mistaken for a cheat. Give 13, and you can never be accused of giving too little. It is a tidy story, and a fitting one, and it may well be true, and here we must be honest, because the real origin of the baker's dozen is not certain, and a good bedtime story is not the same thing as a proven fact. The baker's dozen may or may not come from this, and a good bedtime story is not the same thing as a proven fact. But whether that particular phrase was truly born here or not, the fear behind it certainly was. That is the real point, and it is worth sitting with. The honesty of this man's bread was not, in the end, held up by his own private goodness alone. It was held up by a whole quiet architecture built around him and pressing in on him. The guild at his shoulder, the assize over his scales, the weights and the measures, the taster and the inspector, and the plain, cold, public dread of the pillory in the square. He gave good measure, not only because he was, we may hope, a decent enough man, but because an entire slow, patient, unforgiving system had been assembled over centuries for the single purpose of making very sure that he did. You are protected by a system assembled across centuries for the single purpose of making sure a stranger cannot cheat you on bread. Centuries of institution stand behind a stranger handing you bread and being unable to cheat you. So here, in the quiet of his workshop, is the answer to why the baker rose alone in the deep of the night while the whole town slept on. It was never about virtue, or unusual diligence, or a love of early mornings that nobody could really be expected to have. It was heat. It was simply, entirely, heat. An oven took hours of hard fire to charge, and then gave up that stored fire only slowly, in falling waves, over the hours that followed. If fresh, hot, honest bread was to be waiting when the town opened its eyes, then the fire had to be lit and fed and raked and read long before the town had so much as stirred. The baker did not rise early because he was good. He rose early because the brick was cold, and bread is patient, and neither one of them cared in the slightest what hour a man would have preferred to sleep. Neither the oven nor the law cared what hour a man would have preferred to sleep, and between them they settled his whole life. Between the oven and the law, a baker's whole life was arranged by two things that never once consulted him. And over all of it, invisible in the dark but always present, hung the law that tied every loaf to the price of grain in the fields, and the fear of the pillory that gave that law its teeth. This is why the loaf, when it comes, will be honest, not by accident, and not purely by kindness, but because a whole town, over a very long time, decided that its daily bread was far too important to be left to chance, and built the rules, and the punishments, and the watchers, to make its honesty as close to certain as a flawed world allows. You get dependable bread because somebody built weights, punishments, and watchers into the ordinary business of a loaf. Weights, punishments, and watchers together made honesty about as certain as a flawed world allows. It is a strange and rather moving thing to hold in mind, that so much unseen effort and law and fear should gather, silently, around something as humble and ordinary as a loaf of bread. A man loses his sleep for it, night after night. A guild guards the making of it. A law shapes the weight of it. A punishment waits behind the honesty of it. And in the morning, someone will buy it for a small coin and eat it without a thought, and never once imagine the dark, patient, fire-lit night that had to happen first, over and over, so that the bread could simply, reliably, boringly be there, which is, in its own quiet way, a small definition of civilization. The enormous, invisible labor it takes to make ordinary things dependable. The invisible labor behind an ordinary thing being reliable is enormous, and it is almost never visible to the person enjoying it. And now, at last, the first wave is ready. The baker takes up his long wooden peel and reaches deep into the glowing oven, and one by one he draws the first hot loaves out into the lamplight. They are dark-crusted and steaming faintly in the cool air of the workshop, and he sets them in rows to cool, and the warm, plain, honest smell of new bread begins to fill the whole low room, and to drift, unnoticed, out into the sleeping street. Outside the small window, the sky has not yet even begun to lighten. There is no grey in it yet, no hint of the dawn his whole night has been spent serving. But the work is done, or nearly. The loaves are made, and the baker straightens his back, and wipes his hands, and lets the fire in the oven begin, finally to die. You are still asleep when he lets the fire die, which is the correct and intended order of the arrangement. He lets the fire die at the hour the rest of the town is only beginning to stir. Leave the baker to his cooling loaves, and step now into an ordinary home, the kind of small dark house that fills every town and every village, where an ordinary family lies sleeping. There is only the one room, really, and they are all in it together, gathered under coarse wool blankets on their mattresses of straw. The hearth in the corner has been banked down for the night, exactly as the alewife banked hers, and it gives off only the faintest red breath of warmth into the dark. Everyone is asleep, the house is silent, and then, in the deep middle of the night, in the blackest and stillest part of it, one of them quietly opens their eyes, not startled, not afraid, not woken by any noise, simply, gently, awake, in the dark, at an hour when every reasonable person is supposed to be lost in sleep. Somewhere in the same dark, in a house much like this one, a whole family is awake on purpose, and finds nothing strange about it. Waking in the small hours was not insomnia here. It was simply the middle of a night with two halves. And here is the strange and lovely part, the part that has fascinated the historians who found it. This person is not suffering. They have not been torn from sleep by a bad dream or a full bladder or a crying child. They are not lying there in the dark, tense and frustrated, counting the hours until morning the way you might. They are simply, calmly, awake, in the deep of the night, and it does not trouble them in the slightest. because for them this waking is not a failure of sleep at all. It is not a problem to be solved. It is an ordinary, expected, familiar part of the night, as normal and unremarkable as turning over. They have done this every night of their life. Their parents did it, and they have a name for the sleep they have just finished. They call it their first sleep. They call it their first sleep, and they expect the waking that follows it. The first sleep began near nightfall, which is a great deal earlier than any modern bedtime. This idea that people once slept in two separate stretches with a stretch of waking between them comes above all from the work of one historian, Roger Ickirch, who spent years quietly gathering the evidence for it. And the evidence turned out to be everywhere. Once he knew what he was looking for, he found it scattered across more than 500 separate references in all sorts of old documents that had never been read for this before, in diaries and letters, in medical books, in court records and depositions, in poems and stories and prayers, again and again, in sources that had nothing to do with one another. People mentioned, entirely in passing, as though it needed no explanation at all, their first sleep and their second sleep, and the ordinary waking hour that lay between the two. You would find the interval alarming. They found it ordinary, and had a name for both halves of the night around it. The shape of it seems to have gone something like this. People went to their beds not long after darkness fell, because in a world before cheap, easy light there was very little else to do once the sun was gone, and candles and lamp oil cost real money that most families would rather not burn away into the dark. So they slept early. They sank into that first sleep in the evening, and then, some hours later, somewhere around the middle of the night, they surfaced, naturally, on their own, without any alarm, into a quiet stretch of wakefulness, and after a while, an hour or so, they would sink down again into the second sleep, and stay there until the morning finally came. 2 sleeps, 1 night, and a calm island of waking set down in the very middle of the dark. Ickirch drew on more than 500 references across diaries, court records, medical texts and literature to establish the pattern. 500 references across diaries, court records, medical texts and literature is a considerable body of evidence for something so easily forgotten. So what did they do, all those countless ordinary people, awake together in the small hours of the night? The answer, gathered from all those scattered sources, is quietly wonderful, because the answer is that they did almost everything. They lay still and talked, softly, to whoever shared the bed beside them, in the particular unhurried way that people only ever talk in the dark. They prayed. They rose to tend the banked fire, or to check on a restless child, or to see to an animal. Some got up and worked a little at some quiet task. Some, so the records gently tell us, turned to their husbands or their wives, and found the middle of the night a good and private time for closeness. And a great many of them, it seems, simply lay there in the warm dark, awake, thinking, turning over the dreams they had just risen out of. The waking hour was used for praying, talking quietly, tending the fire, and turning over whatever the first sleep had produced. The hour between sleeps was used rather than endured, which is the part hardest to imagine from inside our own arrangement. There is something deeply peaceful in that last picture, and worth resting on for a moment. An hour, in the middle of the night, that belonged to no one and demanded nothing. No lamp lit, because there was no need to see. No task pressing, because the world was asleep and could not be served. No sense at all that being awake now was wrong, or wasteful, or a sign that something had gone amiss. Just a warm bed, a banked fire breathing faintly in the corner, a body rested from its first sleep, and a quiet, unhurried stretch of dark in which a person might lie and think, or pray, or murmur, or drift, before letting the second sleep gently draw them back down again. It is very hard, lying here now, not to envy them that hour a little. Some medical writers even gave posture advice for it, recommending one side for the first sleep and the other for the second. Advice about which side to sleep on suggests people thought about the two halves separately, and expected both. The people of the time seem to have taken the whole two-part rhythm entirely for granted, as simply the way that sleep was, the way we take a single unbroken night for granted now. Some of their physicians and writers even offered careful, earnest, practical advice about how best to do it. There was guidance, in some of the medical books, on which side one ought to lie for each part of the night. Sleep on your right side, some of them recommended, through the first sleep, and then turn over to your left side for the second. Children, meanwhile, were thought to need far more, and longer, and less broken sleep than their parents, closer to the deep, unbroken nights we now imagine as normal for everyone. The night, in other words, had a structure people understood, and thought about, and passed gently down. The night had a structure people understood, discussed, and handed down, rather than one long block to be got through. Now, here honesty asks us to slow down and be careful, because a good story and a proven fact are not always the same thing, and a story told at bedtime should be honest about the difference. The evidence that a church gathered is real. The references genuinely exist, in their hundreds, across all those scattered sources. That much is not in doubt. But what those references truly mean, and how universal this two-part sleeping ever really was, is a question that historians still turn over among themselves. Not everyone is fully persuaded that it was as neat, or as deliberate, or as widespread as the tidy phrase first sleep and second sleep can make it sound, and it is worth being plain about that, rather than pretending the past is more certain than it is. The evidence is strong, and it is not unanimous, and it is worth being plain about that, rather than tidying it. Strong is not the same as unanimous, and the difference is worth keeping in view. Some scholars, and the historian Niall Boyce is one voice among them, have gently questioned the neatness of the picture. Perhaps, they suggest, first and second sleep did not always mean two truly separate sleeps with a long, deliberate waking hour set firmly between them. Perhaps the same words sometimes meant only the natural phases of a single night's rest, the deeper and the lighter stretches that any sleeper drifts through, and any waking between them was brief and half-conscious and quickly gone. The truth may well lie somewhere in the middle, and it may have varied from place to place and person to person and season to season. History rarely hands us a single clean answer, and it does not here, and there is no shame in saying so out loud in the dark. History rarely offers a single clean answer, and it does not offer one here either. Saying so plainly is better than tidying the evidence into a neater shape than it actually has. But the debate itself, in the end, need not trouble your rest tonight, because the heart of the thing is not really in dispute. In the long ages before the electric light, sleep was simply a different country than it is for you. It was ruled by darkness, and by cold, and by the true depth of a night with no easy way to push it back. It began early. When the light failed, it was often shared, several bodies to a bed, for warmth and company. And it was, in some real and widespread way that we can no longer fully recover, less of a single solid block than we now assume it must always have been. However you settle the finer arguments, the deep shape of the human night has plainly moved. Ours is the strange new arrangement. Theirs was the old one. Our unbroken night is the recent arrangement. Theirs was the older one, and it lasted a great deal longer. The unbroken night we treat as natural is a recent arrangement, and theirs lasted considerably longer than ours has. It is worth knowing, too, just how far back the plain traces of it reach, and where the historian first caught the thread. One of the clearest early references Eckert turned up came not from a diary or a poem, but from a court, from the year 1697, in the sworn testimony of a witness describing an ordinary night. She spoke, entirely in passing, of waking after her first sleep, and thought nothing of the phrase, and needed to explain it to no one, because everyone in that room already knew exactly what she meant. It is a small and quiet moment, but it is the kind of thing that makes the vanished past feel suddenly, almost unbearably close. An ordinary person, on an ordinary night, long ago, waking in the dark exactly the way this sleeping family just did. Somebody was lying awake in the middle of the night, on an ordinary night, long ago, exactly as this family is now. That reference from 1697 is also a gentle reminder that this way of sleeping was not sealed off tidily inside the Middle Ages, and did not vanish at some clean and convenient date. It belonged to the whole long age before cheap and easy light, an age that stretched across many centuries and slipped quietly on well past the medieval world into times much nearer our own. The broken night did not so much end as it was, at last, lit up out of existence, one small flame at a time. Artificial light did not end that night so much as gradually erase it, one small flame at a time. Artificial light erased that night gradually, rather than abolishing it, one small flame at a time. So let the argument rest, and simply return to the sleeping family, and to the one of them lying quietly awake in the middle of the night. Whatever the scholars finally decide about how common it was, or how deliberate, or exactly what the old words meant, this person is not the least bit troubled to be conscious in the dark. There is nothing to fix, and nothing to fear. The banked fire breathes softly in its corner. The others sleep on, close and warm, all around. The long night has plenty of room in it, room enough for 2 full sleeps and a peaceful waking between, and no reason at all to hurry from one into the next. This is simply the middle of the night, doing exactly what the middle of the night has always quietly done. The middle of the night went on doing quietly what it had always done, whether or not anyone had a word for it. The middle of the night went on doing what it always had, with or without a name. And perhaps that is the gentlest thing this old rhythm has to offer, across all the centuries, to anyone who lies awake now. That waking in the dark need not be a battle, that the small hours are not in themselves an enemy or a failure, that for most of the human story, to surface quietly in the middle of the night was not a fault in one's sleep, but simply a part of it, an expected pause, a calm and ordinary interval, nothing to be won or lost. There is an old, deep, patient permission in that idea, the permission to be awake for a while in the dark, and to let it be soft and untroubled and brief, and to trust, as they trusted, that sleep will come back on its own, in its own time, and carry you down again. Sleep comes back on its own if you let it, which is what they trusted and what you are about to find out. Trusting sleep to return is easier when everybody around you has always expected it to. The waking one shifts at last, without any hurry. They draw the coarse blanket a little higher against the cool of the room. They listen, for a moment longer, to the soft breathing of the family close around them, and to the faint settle of the banked fire in its corner. The thoughts of the waking hour grow slower now, and looser, and begin to come apart at the edges. The dark presses gently down. The second sleep is rising up to meet them, the way the tide comes quietly back over sand, and there is no reason in the world to resist it. And so, easily, without a struggle, the way it was always meant to happen, they let their eyes fall closed, and slip back down beneath the surface of the night, into the deep and dreamless rest that waits on the far side of the dark. The second sleep is the deeper one, and it waits on the far side of the waking rather than being interrupted by it. There is one more group of people awake in the deep of this medieval night, and they are perhaps the quietest of all. Leave the sleeping house behind, and come to the edge of a monastery, where a cold stone church stands dark against the stars. Inside, in the black hours long before any dawn, small figures are moving, monks, in their heavy robes, their hoods drawn up against the chill, come one by one out of the darkness of the dormitory and into the darkness of the church, carrying the faint wavering light of candles. They do not speak. They move slowly, and by long habit, finding their places in the wooden choir stalls almost without needing to see. And there, in the deepest and coldest part of the night, when nearly every other soul for miles is fast asleep, they gather, on purpose, to pray. While the town sleeps, a community a few miles off is getting up on purpose, in the dark, to pray. The They gathered on purpose, in the dark, when nearly every other soul for miles was asleep. This gathering was no accident of restlessness, and no private choice. It was written down, and ordered, and old. The shape of the monastic day was set out in the 6th century in the rule of Saint Benedict, a quiet, practical, deeply humane document that would go on to order the lives of countless monks for many centuries after the man himself was gone. The rule laid out a whole round of daily gatherings for prayer, a rhythm of offices spread carefully across the hours of the day and the night, so that the whole of time might be turned steadily toward God. And the very first of those gatherings, the one that opened the entire cycle, did not come with the morning light, as you might expect. It came in the dark. It came in the dead middle of the night. The rule of Saint Benedict placed the first office of the day in the dead middle of the night, and meant it literally. Placing the first office in the deep middle of the dark was deliberate, and the rule says so. The monks rose for it in the small hours, somewhere around 2 in the morning, at the very bottom of the night. Think for a moment of what that asks of a body, night after night, year after year, for a whole life, to leave a warm bed in the coldest, darkest, most reluctant hour there is. To rise not once in a while, in some emergency, but every single night, as the settled and unremarkable habit of a lifetime. There was no comfort in it, and no drama either. It was simply the shape of the vocation, accepted and repeated until it became as natural as breathing, while the baker tended his fire and the sleeping family drifted between their 2 sleeps. These men rose in the dark and walked to church, and did it again the next night and the next, without end. They rose, walked to church, and did it again the next night and the next, for the whole of their lives. Doing it again the next night and the next, without end, is the part that is hard to hold in the mind. The office they gathered to sing had more than one name, and each name tells you something quiet and true about it. Sometimes it was called matins, sometimes it was called vigils, and that second word carries the whole feeling of the thing, because vigils comes straight from the old idea of the night watches, the watches of the night, the practice of staying awake and watchful through the dark hours while the rest of the world sleeps on. To keep vigil is to stay awake on purpose, faithfully, in the night, for the sake of something you believe matters more than your own rest. And that is exactly what these men were doing in their cold stalls, by their thin candlelight, in the small hours, keeping watch, holding the night open, refusing to let all the dark hours pass entirely unwitnessed and unkept. The stated purpose was to keep the night from passing entirely unwitnessed, which is a strange and rather beautiful job to give a building full of people. The purpose behind it was gentle and rather beautiful once you understand the thought beneath it. The night, to their way of seeing, was not simply empty, dead time to be slept away and written off. It was part of the whole God-given day, and so it too should be marked and honoured and offered up, rather than surrendered wholly to sleep and silence. By rising to pray in the dead centre of the dark, the monks were, in their own words, breaking up the night and making it holy, planting one steady point of light and voice in the middle of all those unwatched hours. The rest of the world let the night pass unconscious. The monks, alone, stood up in the middle of it and kept it, deliberately, on behalf of everyone else who could not. Somebody stood up in the middle of the dark and kept it on behalf of everyone who could not, including you. Keeping the hours on behalf of people who never knew it was happening is a peculiar and rather generous arrangement. And the office itself, the thing they actually did once they had gathered in the cold, was quiet and patterned and slow. At its heart was the singing of the psalms, those ancient songs of longing and praise and lament, chanted low and steady in the dark, voice answering voice across the choir. Around the psalms came readings, passages spoken aloud into the stillness, and then responsories, sung replies that rose and fell in answer to what had been read. There was a shape to it, a settled and familiar order, the same night after night, so that the mind did not have to strain or decide, but could simply enter the rhythm and be carried by it. It was not a performance, it was a practice, worn smooth by endless repetition, as comfortable and as wearing as an old stone step hollowed by centuries of feet. The repetition was endless and comfortable and wearing, in the way an old stone step is hollowed by feet. An old stone step hollowed by centuries of feet is the right image, and it is both comfortable and wearing. On the ordinary nights, the office was long enough, but on the great feast days it grew longer still, unfolding into a fuller and more elaborate shape. It might expand into 3 separate sections, 3 nocturnes, one after another through the dark, each one carrying its own set of psalms and its own set of readings, so that the holiest nights of the year were marked by the longest and richest watches of all, and through all of it, ordinary and feast alike, the monks stayed on their feet and at their prayer, holding the long night open with their voices, while beyond the monastery walls the whole sleeping country knew nothing of it, and turned over in its beds, and dreamed. Beyond the walls the sleeping country knew nothing about any of it, and turned over, and dreamed. The country slept through all of it, entirely unaware, which was rather the point of somebody staying awake. And here is a quiet detail that ties this cold church back to the warm bed you visited a little while ago. The ordinary sleeping family, waking in the middle of the night between their 2 sleeps, drifted after a while back down into their second sleep, and slept on until morning. The monks did no such thing. Having risen in the dark for their night office, they did not, as a rule, simply return to their beds and sink back into sleep afterward. The watch, once kept, gave way not to more rest, but to the slow beginning of another day of prayer and work. 2 kinds of people, awake in the very same dark hour, in the very same world. One would sleep again before dawn, the other would not, and almost no one else, anywhere outside those monastery walls, rose in the deep of the night to pray at all. Almost nobody outside those walls rose in the deep of the night to pray, which is exactly what made it worth doing. That, in the end, is what set these watching men so quietly apart. To rise in the dead of night was, for the ordinary world, either an accident or an emergency, something that happened to you, not something you chose. Only here, inside these walls, was it done on purpose, and by rule, and with love, every single night, as the settled centre of a whole way of life. And even here, the exact hour of it was never quite fixed the way we would fix it now, because these were not people who lived by a clock. The night was measured from the falling of the sun and the coming of the dawn, and those move, all year, with the turning seasons. So the deep hour of the watch drifted a little with the calendar, earlier and later, longer and shorter, following the real dark rather than any number on a dial. The hours moved with the real dark rather than with any number, so the office came earlier and later across the year. Following the real dark rather than a number on a dial meant the office moved through the year with the season. So gather the whole of it into one still picture and let it settle. In the deepest, coldest part of the medieval night, in a dark stone church lit only by a scatter of candles, a company of robed men stood in their wooden stalls and sang the old psalms low into the dark. This was the night office, the vigils of the rule of Saint Benedict, kept faithfully around 2 in the morning, built of psalms and readings and quiet sung replies, and meant for nothing grander and nothing smaller than to keep the long night and to make it holy. It asked for no audience, it sought no reward, it simply happened, night after night after night, a small steady flame of voices in the middle of the sleeping dark, whether anyone in the wide world beyond ever knew of it or not. And almost no one did know of it, and that is somehow the most peaceful part of all. Out across the whole dark country, the ordinary people slept on, wholly unaware. None of them heard the singing. None of them needed to. The watch was kept for them anyway, quietly, without their knowledge and without any thanks. One small point of wakefulness and voice held open in the vast, silent, sleeping dark. There is a deep and simple comfort in that thought. The comfort of knowing that somewhere, always, in the worst and blackest hour of the night, someone chose to be gently awake, so that the darkness was never, anywhere, entirely unwatched. It is worth carrying that comfort with you now, down toward your own rest. That the deep of the night has always had its quiet keepers. That, in every age, in the coldest and stillest hour, some few souls have stayed softly awake, on purpose, holding the dark open with a voice, or a prayer, or simply a patient, watchful presence, so that the rest of the world could let go and sink down and sleep without fear. You are not the first to lie awake in the small hours, and you will not be the last, and you are in far older and far gentler company than the loneliness of the dark might ever let you feel. The watch has always been kept. It is being kept somewhere still. And tonight, at last, it is not your turn to keep it. In the cold church, the last psalm of the watch rises and holds, and then slowly fades away into the old stone, until the final low note has gone entirely, and only silence is left behind. The monks stand a moment longer in the quiet they have made. Then, one by one, the small candles are lifted and carried out, and their little lights withdraw down the dark passages and vanish, until the church is left wholly to the dark and the deep cold and the enormous stillness. The watch is done, the night has been kept, and the great silence comes flooding gently back into the empty stone, needing nothing more from anyone, asking nothing further to be said, settling over everything like snow, like sleep, like the soft and final closing of a very old and very heavy door. There is nothing left now to learn, and nothing left to do, and nowhere at all that you need to be. So let it all begin, gently, to fade. Let the warm inn go first. The low room, the banked fire, the last quiet cup, the sleeping strangers on their straw. Let the branch over the door hang still. Let the whole warm house grow faint and further away until it is only a small remembered glow somewhere far behind you in the dark. You do not need to hold on to any of it. It is safe to let it go. There is only the dark now, and it is soft, and it is kind, and it is enough. Let the baker fade next. The low workshop, the glowing oven, the warm smell of new bread, the loaves cooling in their rows. Let it all soften and recede and grow quiet, until it too is only a faint and fading warmth somewhere far off in the settling dark. You do not need to follow it. You do not need to keep it. Let the night take it, gently, the way the night takes everything and asks for nothing back. Breathe slowly. Let your body grow heavy where it lies. There is nowhere to go, and nothing to carry, and nothing at all that you must do. Let the quiet house fade too. The small dark room, the sleeping family, the banked hearth breathing in its corner, the one who woke, and thought a while, and slipped back down into sleep. Let them all grow faint, and far, and still, until they are only the memory of a warmth, dissolving into the night. You are not far behind them now. Your thoughts are slowing. The edges of everything are going soft. Let the last of it loosen, and fall away, and let yourself begin, at last, to sink down after them, into the same deep and gentle dark. Let the cold church fade last of all. Let the candles withdraw, one by one, until their small lights are gone. Let the low-sung voices grow faint, and fainter, and finally still. Let the great silence come flooding back, soft and vast and complete, and carry the whole quiet watch away with it into the dark. There is nothing left to keep awake for now. So let the last light go. Let the last sound fade. Let the darkness close gently over all of it, the way sleep closes over a long day, and rest now, fully, in the deep and quiet dark that is left. Now there is only the fire, only a low bed of embers in the dark, glowing faint and warm and red, breathing softly to itself, asking nothing of you at all. Everything else has faded gently away. There is nothing more to hear, and nothing more to know, and nothing more that needs to be said. The words are done now. Only the quiet warmth remains, and the soft red light, and the deep and easy dark all around it. Let your breath grow slow. Let the last of your thoughts drift down and settle like ash over coals. There is only the fire now, and it will keep. Rest. You are warm, you are safe, and the night will hold you, gently, all the way through, until the morning comes.